everybody. Welcome to our chat. If you mind turning the slide here. My name is Maria Zank, and I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Society. And I also have Mary Gillum here, who will be leading our presentation today. The title here is, Did you file a joint tax return and lose your refund? And do you owe a joint federal income tax liability? And Mary will tell us all about that as we go through this presentation today. So why are you watching this stream today? We are going to give an overview of legal aid, who we are and what we do. We'll give you a quick scope of the services that we provide at the Legal Aid Society, and a discussion of the ways to protect your tax refund or get back offset refunds and ways to remove your tax debt. This would be called injured spouse claims and innocent spouse relief requests. And here is some of our contact information. We have our website, our phone number, 1-800-238-1443, and our tax hotline, which is 1-866-481-3669. And there's our link to donate as well. So who are we? We are these counties here in the middle of Tennessee. We provide services to all of these counties, and tax as well provides service to extra counties throughout the entire state, except for the 4 counties around Memphis. So the types of cases we take are all civil cases. We take consumer cases, employment and reentry cases, family cases involving domestic violence, immigration, health benefits and education, housing, and of course, tax. So how do we help? We provide education to the public and to individuals serving in other organizations. We give counsel and advice to people. We run in-person clinics. We draft life planning documents. We handle administrative disputes and, of course, representation in court. So how can you get help if you need it? You can call our phone number that I mentioned earlier, and of course our tax hotline, 1-866-481-3669. You can visit our website to learn more about us, or check our website to find any of our free legal clinics. And of course, these are all of our local office numbers. If you live in one of our service areas, you can directly contact that office. And there are other ways that you can get help besides us. Here are all of the places that we've listed, and feel free to check any of these resources out as well. So I mentioned the Tennessee Taxpayer Project a little bit earlier, that we also do a lot of tax work within the Legal Aid Society. Specifically, we are a low-income taxpayer clinic within the larger firm that is the Legal Aid Society. We provide free legal representation to all taxpayers who need help with federal income tax disputes or have disputes with the Internal Revenue Service or the IRS. And again, we have a free tax hotline that anyone is welcome to call toll-free, 1-866-481-3669. So I'm going to start asking Mary some questions here. The first one that I have is, did you file a joint federal income tax return and lose your refund because of a debt your spouse owes? And you might qualify for an injured spouse claim. I'll turn it over to Mary now.
And you're appropriately stating that you could qualify for the injured spouse claim. So that leads us to really our next question.
What is an injured spouse claim, Mary?
Thank you, Maria. basically, when you're married and as a married couple, you have a choice. You can file a married filing joint tax return, or you can file as married filing separate. When a married couple files a joint tax return, the courts have really held that each taxpayer might have a separate legal interest in that joint refund. So not every spouse has a separate legal interest in a joint tax refund, but it's possible. And an injured spouse claim is really a way to protect your separate legal interests or your part of that tax refund. So injured spouse claims are really important.
Well, how do you know if you have a debt that the Department of Treasury might offset?
Well, the best way, if you don't already know, most of the time you might already know because you've received a notice from the agency who claims that you owe, and they give you an appeals period where you can file an appeal and have a hearing. A lot of people don't get that notice or seem to overlook that notice. So if you're not sure or you didn't get the notice, but you think you might have a debt, you can call the Department of the Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Services, and they have a telephone number which you can enter some information, and they can tell you if an agency or has turned in an offset against you. So it's something I recommend that everybody do prior to tax season. So if you're listening right now, you might want to jot this number down. It's 1-800-304-3107. And that's the Department of Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Services number that you can call. It's toll free, and you will put in information about yourself, and they will tell you if someone has turned in a debt, has certified a debt against you, which they're going to try to collect through maybe the offset of your federal income tax refund.
Who can qualify for an injured spouse claim?
Great question, Maria. There's really 4 different requirements. And the first one is that you file a joint tax return. You either file one or you plan to file one. So that's the first requirement. You can't file an injured spouse claim if you're just filing as head of household, or married filing separate, or single. Injured spouse would not be applicable in those situations. So you have to either file or plan to file a joint married filing joint return with your spouse. And you have to be legally married to be able to do that. The second requirement is that you don't owe the tax debt. I'm sorry, you don't owe the debt that the Department of Treasury is collecting. That could be the tax debt. That could be another debt like child support. It could be an unpaid or defaulted student loan, but you don't owe it. Your spouse owes it. And that's what makes you injured, because you don't owe the debt. So that's the second requirement. The third requirement is that you earn some of the income that's shown on that joint tax return, or you qualify for credits that's unique to you. Let me give you an example. Obviously, if you work and have wages, you're going to meet that requirement. But let's say you don't work or have wages, but you did not get your stimulus payments. You can claim your stimulus payments through a tax return called and you do that through something called the recovery rebate credit. So that recovery rebate credit is unique to you. You don't have to have earnings to qualify for that recovery rebate credit. And so that would be one of the exceptions to having earned income on the tax return. The fourth requirement is that you paid some of the taxes that were shown on the W-2 or withholding on the joint return, or if you're self-employed, that you would be responsible for, that's your income, and you'll be responsible for paying that self-employment tax. Or even more importantly, what a lot of people qualify is because their income qualifies them for refundable tax credits. So you're married filing joint. If you file separately and you have 2 children, you would be the one that would claim those 2 children. Your earned income might qualify you for earned income credit. So that would meet the fourth requirement. If you have children and you have earned income that would qualify for the earned income credit. So you either pay some of the taxes through withholding, or you qualify for refundable credits. So just real quick recap: you either file jointly or plan to file jointly. You don't owe the debt that would be offset. Your spouse owes the debt. You earn some of the income on the return, or you have eligibility for certain credits that's unique to you. And lastly, you either have federal taxes withheld, or you would be the one qualifying for certain credits that are claimed on the return.
Do you have to file a joint federal income tax return to qualify for an injured spouse claim?
Okay, great question. Let me just kind of back up a moment and say you don't have to file a joint federal income tax return just because you're married. A lot of married people think that they do have to do that. You do not have to do that. You have a choice if you're married. You can choose to file jointly, or you can choose to file married filing separate. Some people can even choose to file head of household if they're married. If they live apart from their spouse the last 6 months of the year, they may be considered unmarried for tax purposes and maybe qualify for head of household if they meet the other requirements for head of household, such as paying more than half the cost to maintain the home for a qualifying person. So you don't have to file jointly just because you're married. That we hear that assumption a lot. However, if you file married filing separate, one thing that really is a reason a lot of people don't file jointly is that you might have a higher tax rate. You might not qualify for certain tax credits like the earned income tax credit. You can't even get that if you file married filing separate. So a lot of people are kind of forced into filing jointly with their spouse just to have a lower tax rate and also to get maybe refundable credits like the earned income tax credit that they would not otherwise get if they filed married filing separate. So, but for an injured spouse claim, to help you must file or intend to file a joint federal income tax return.
Thank you. What types of debts can qualify when filing an injured spouse claim?
Okay. Well, eligible debts basically includes any debts the Department of Treasury federal offset program can collect that they're authorized to collect through their Bureau of Fiscal Services. But what are some examples? Eligible debts include child support. So if your spouse owes child support, it might be public benefit overpayments. Maybe you were paid too much SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamp benefits. And so now you owe that money back, or your spouse does. It could be any public benefit like AFDC, Aid for Families with Dependent Children, defaulted student loans, unemployment. If you received unemployment and the unemployment office said you shouldn't have received it and they're trying to collect it back from you, that would be a debt that would be put through the Department of Treasury's offset program. Social Security they said they've overpaid that. They've overpaid you. They can collect that from your tax refund offset. Could be taxes from before you were married, or maybe your spouse's taxes that they owed the IRS before you were married. It could even be taxes that maybe your spouse owes while you were married, but he filed or she filed a married filing separate return and they owe those taxes. But when he or she files jointly with you, the Treasury's offset program will come in and swoop down and grab that refund when you file jointly, even though that's from his return or her return from when you filed married filing separate. So those are the debts. So you want to consider an injured spouse claim to protect your separate legal interest in that refund. So those are an example of the types of debts that qualify for filing injured spouse claim, debts that you don't owe but your spouse owes.
Well, what if the debt is from a joint tax return that you filed with your spouse?
Yes. So if you file a joint return and a tax debt is listed on the return, both you and your spouse technically owe that debt, even if none of your income contributed to that tax liability. Even if you get divorced and a court order says that your spouse is responsible, that's under state court. Under federal law, under the IRS still considers you responsible. So this is something lawyers like to call joint and several liability. An injured spouse claim won't help you in this situation if the debt is from a return that you file with your spouse and that debt's listed on that return. There is something that you can do that we're going to talk about later this evening, and that's called innocent spouse relief. But an injured spouse claim won't help you if you actually owe the tax debt. And you actually owe it if you file jointly and the debt is created on that joint return itself, which is different from injured spouse claim. You're usually getting a refund and you're trying to get your part of the refund. So innocent spouse, we'll talk about that a little bit later. That would be a remedy you would pursue instead of injured spouse if the debt is from a joint tax return where you filed with your spouse.
Well, Mary, am I required to have earned income to qualify for an injured spouse claim?
Most of the time, you must have earned income to really qualify for an injured spouse claim. There are some exceptions, and one exception is a tax credit that we've already talked about, like the recovery rebate credit that's unique to you, or a credit you can claim for maybe, that's the credit you can claim for missing stimulus payments. So there, generally, you do have to have some type of income. It doesn't have to. It says earned income here in your question. That's the best because that qualifies you for some of the good tax credits. But you don't even have to have earned income. You could just have unearned income like dividends or interest, and maybe had taxes withheld, and part of the refund is attributable to the taxes you had withheld from that unearned income. And you might be able to qualify for an injured spouse claim. Remember, there's a refund on the return, and if you contributed to it, but it would get taken, and you don't know the debt it would be taken for, your spouse does, then you might qualify for an injured spouse claim.
Well, what is considered earned income then?
Great question. And earned income is basically income in exchange for services rendered or provided. It's income from wages from work. It's self-employment income. Examples of self-employment income could be money you get for providing services, cleaning a house, or yard work you're doing for somebody, or maybe even childcare or babysitting. Those things are earned income. Again, you don't earn income for an injured spouse claim, but the big refunds that usually come for in relation to the earned income tax credit, which requires earned income, is why the concept of earned income is so important.
Can you give me an example of how an injured spouse claim might actually work?
Very good question. I bet you could give a couple of examples of this too, Maria, because I know you've probably seen this. But we'll just say we'll call this taxpayer Lisa, and we'll just say Lisa earns about $10,000, and she earned $10,000 last year, which was back in 2022, and Lisa had taxes withheld from her wages and her paycheck, 2 children. And Lisa would claim the children on her tax return if she filed as married filing separate. She's married and she wants to get the earned income tax credit. She knows if she files as married filing separate that she will automatically be disqualified from the earned income tax credit. And she knows that's a huge benefit and does not want to leave that on the table. Her spouse only receives SSI, or supplemental security income. And that's all he received in 2002. So she decided, even knowing her choices, that she doesn't have to file jointly. She knows she's going to get the biggest refund if she files jointly. So she files a joint return with her spouse. The only problem is her spouse owes a debt. And before they were married, her spouse owed the IRS money. And he also owes on child support. So he actually owes 2 debts. Both of those debts are debts that are eligible for the Department of Treasury through their offset program to take the refund, the joint tax refund. So if Lisa does nothing in this example, what's going to happen? Let's say that Lisa is expecting a refund of $6,200. If Lisa does nothing with that joint tax refund, even though she doesn't owe that tax debt that her spouse owes to the IRS, even though she does not owe the child support debt, the Department of Treasury will come in and take that joint refund to pay her spouse's debts. Now, because Lisa attended this Facebook Live event, she's learned about injured spouse claims, and she met the 4 requirements for filing an injured spouse claim. So she will file an injured spouse claim with her tax return because she already knows about the debts. And what that is telling the IRS is, she's saying, there's debts here that my spouse owes that I don't owe. I want you to look at this tax return and give me my part of the refund. Well, because her spouse has SSI income, that's not earned income. He would not have qualified for the earned income tax credit, which is the biggest credit she's getting on her return, if he filed separately. Neither one of them would have been if they filed separately. If they filed separately, and she would have been the one that would have claimed the children. So she's going to fill out injured spouse claim because he didn't contribute to that refund. He had no earned income. He had no federal income tax withholdings. When she files her injured spouse claim, she's going to get 100% of that refund back. Her separate legal interest in that refund happens to be 100%. And you might have heard me say earlier, there are some times that even though you file jointly, you may not have a legal interest in the refund. Lisa's spouse actually had 0 legal interest in that joint refund. because he did not contribute to that refund at all. He would not have claimed the kids if they filed separate. He didn't have earned income to qualify for the earned income credit. And his SSI, which is unearned income, did not have any federal income tax withholding. So when she files her injured spouse claim, she's going to get back 100% of that refund or all of it. So Lisa is a great candidate, the best possible candidate we could have for an injured spouse claim. Now, that might not be your situation. You might only get 40% of the refund or 30%, but it's sure better than losing 100% of it to the Department of Treasury's offset program. So that's an example how an injured spouse claim might work.
Well, how do I actually file an injured spouse claim, Mary?
I bet you know the answer to that, Maria. There's a certain tax form, and it is an IRS form 8379. And where could I find that injured spouse form, Maria? Do you have any idea?
I'm guessing maybe the IRS website.
And you are exactly correct. You will find that injured spouse claim at www.irs.gov, which is the IRS's website. And when you pull up their website, you put that in your computer and their website appears. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a box, and it's a search box. And you would type in there, IRS form 8379. You can type in injured spouse claim, but you'll get a whole lot of stuff maybe that you don't want to look at. It would be helpful, but it's extra stuff. So if you want to learn more about it, that's a good idea. But if you're just wanting the form and that's all you need, just type IRS form 8379. Now, you can file it by mail, or you can actually electronically file an injured spouse claim if it's being filed with your tax return, your original tax return. But if the injured spouse claim is being filed independently or by itself, it has to be filed by mail. But if you can e-file an amended return or your original return, you can certainly electronically file or e-file your injured spouse claim with those original return or maybe even amended return. One important thing when you're looking at that IRS form 8379, don't forget to put the correct year in there. The correct year will be the year you're filing the return for. We all just finished, except for those of us that have extensions, but we all just finished filing the 2022 tax return in 2023. So you would want to put 2022 as the year at issue here for the injured spouse claim in part 1 of that form 8379. Now, don't forget, very, very important, part 2 of that IRS form 8379, don't forget to check the box that you're the injured spouse. If you don't, then the IRS they won't know, they'll maybe pick one, which might not be the right person. Or if you accidentally check that your spouse is the injured spouse claim and as the injured spouse, and your spouse owes the debt, then the IRS is going to deny you an injured spouse claim. So be very careful. I see this mistake a lot, even by tax preparers when they get in a hurry and they check the wrong box. Make sure you're checking that you are the injured spouse, or the injured spouse claim will be denied because your spouse won't qualify if your spouse is the one that owes the debt. So that's important to know. On the back page or the second page of the IRS form 8379, basically the IRS has you list all the income listed on the return. Then they have you divided up on what part was yours, what part was your spouse's. So, for example, if you both had wages, you'll list that in the first column, the total wages. In the second column, you'll list how much of those total wages belong to you. And in the third column, you might list how much belongs to the injured, amount belongs to your spouse, not the non-injured spouse. So you basically take all the income and you then in one column, and in the next two columns, you're separating out how much was yours, how much was attributable to your spouse. You'll do the same exact thing for any tax withholding. You'll put the total listed on the return as federal income tax withholding, but then you'll put how much was yours on your W-2 in one column, and then how much was your spouse's. And you'll do the same thing for most tax credits. However, the IRS says you don't have to allocate the earned income credit. They'll do that one for you because it's kind of complicated. And it's not a set amount per child like the child tax credit is. So they'll do that one for you. So you fill out an IRS 8379 form. It's simply 2 pages. First page is mostly questions. And you answer those questions. Just make sure to put the year, the correct year. Make sure to mark that you're the injured spouse person. And on the second page, you will allocate the income, the tax withholdings, the deductions, and tax credits. And then the IRS will take it from there once you file it.
Well, how do I get an IRS Form 8379 or an injured spouse claim?
So, oops, we kind of already told the answer to part of this, but that's at the www.irs.gov, and you put that form, IRS Form 8379 or 8379 in the search box on the IRS website. But if you're having some problems doing that or just not able to locate the form, something's going wrong, maybe the IRS website's down, not working at the time, you could always give us a call. We operate a toll-free tax hotline, and you can call that hotline. That number is, and I'll say it a couple times during this presentation, it is 866-481-3669. And actually, Maria mentioned that number earlier on one of the very beginning slides that we were talking about when we were talking about phone numbers. So you're always welcome to call us, and we can send that form out to you as well through our tax hotline that we operate.
What if I know that the Department of Treasury is going to keep a joint tax refund before I file my return?
Okay, and if you already know it's going to happen, which is great, you have that knowledge, then you want to file the injured spouse claim with your tax return. Don't file it separately. You'll have it, the IRS will work it the quickest if you file it with your joint tax return. So if you know they're going to offset before you file, you fill out the form 8379 and you attach it to your tax return. You don't have to sign the injured spouse claim if you're filing it with your tax return. You will simply put up in the upper left-hand corner of the front of your 1040, you'll just write the words injured spouse claim. That way the IRS doesn't overlook it when they're processing your tax return. And when they're processing your return, then they'll come to the 8379 form, and then they will do that allocation to help you and make sure you get your separate legal interest in that joint tax refund. So you could e-file it with your original tax return. You can file it by mail, but if you already know about the debt, I would always file it with my tax return when I'm filing my original tax return. So that way they work it as quick as possible and you get that separate legal interest as quick as possible.
What if the Department of the Treasury has already offset or kept my joint refund?
Okay, so let's say you got a big surprise that you didn't want to get. You're waiting on that money to come. It never came. You called the IRS, and the IRS says, oh, we kept that refund. The Treasury had us keep that refund and send it to them because of your spouse's child support debt. If that's your situation, you find out you get a notice. You'll get a notice from the Department of the Treasury saying we kept your refund. And the IRS will tell you that too. They'll send you out a letter usually saying that the refund was approved, but you're not getting anything because it was offset. Then you'll still do the IRS Form 8379, which is your injured spouse claim. This time, you're going to definitely have to sign page 2, though, because when you file it by itself without an original return, you have to sign the injured spouse claim. So you'll sign page 2. You will mail it to the IRS wherever you normally file your returns. So, for example, if you're listening today and you live in Tennessee and you filed your original return was filed with no money being sent with it, for example, you were getting a refund, which is the whole point of the injured spouse claim, then you will file your injured spouse claim. You will fill out the Form 8379. You will sign the back page and date it. And then you will attach any of your W-2s or 1099s to show that income belongs to you or those tax withholdings belong to you. And you will mail that to the Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service on the second line. And the third line will be Kansas City, Missouri, 64999-0002. And there is no street address, so that is correct. It's just Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service, Kansas City, Missouri, 64999-0002. And remember, attach your W-2s and 1099s to show what part of that income belongs to you. Or if it's self-employment, attach a copy of your Schedule C that goes with your tax return when you're self-employed.
How long does it take the IRS to work one of these injured spouse claims?
Injured spouse claims are worked a lot quicker than what we're going to talk about later, which is innocent spouse relief. They're generally worked in 8 to 14 weeks. During the pandemic, though, that wasn't quite the case. It was taking almost a year, which was not good. But innocent spouse relief may take a year or longer. But injured spouse claims, they're usually worked in 8 to 14 weeks. For example, tax returns that I electronically filed in April of this year, and I attached the injured spouse claim because we knew the refund was going to be offset to pay these other spouse's debt. Those were all worked before the end of July, all the ones I filed in April. So it's about 8 to 14 weeks to process the injured spouse claim when you're filing with the IRS.
Do I have to actually file the injured spouse claim?
Okay, you do have to actually file it, or the IRS will never, ever say, oh, he owes a debt, she doesn't owe the debt, or she owes it, he doesn't, and allocate it for you. You have to file an injured spouse claim. So then you want to know, how long do I have to file an injured spouse claim? And generally, anybody that's filing a tax return requesting a refund must file a tax return within 3 years of the due date of that return. You can file it outside of 3 years, but the IRS is going to say, oh, we don't got to pay you now because there's something called a refund statute of limitations and you missed it. So you've got to file the tax return within 3 years of the due date. But let's say you did that and you're hearing about it today, but they kept your refund from 4 years ago or 5 years ago, but you did file your return within 3 years of the due date. Are you out of luck? No. Actually, under the IRS policy manual, you have up to 6 years to file a return and file an injured spouse claim and get your money that was offset back. So if you've already filed the return, remember, you got to do that part within 3 years, and you did, but it was 5 years ago that they kept your refund. You're still within the time frame to file an injured spouse claim by itself and ask for your part or your separate legal interest in that joint refund to come back to you, even though it was paid to child support. Maybe it was sent off to pay the defaulted student loan. It can be clawed back for that time period. So if you have, in the last 6 years, lost a refund because of your spouse's debt and that you didn't know, then you need to be maybe giving us a call and thinking about these injured spouse claims.
Well, what if I need help filing an injured spouse claim or the IRS denies the claim that I sent in?
Great question, Maria. And what would you guess the answer to that one would be?
I think I'd probably call for help.
Good answer. You may need to file an appeal, and it would be really good for you to maybe get an attorney to help you out. You don't have to have one, but you generally have 30 days after a denial to file an appeal. So you can do that on your own, or you can contact the Legal Aid Society's Tennessee Taxpayer Project at that 1-866-481-3669 and ask for help filing an appeal. Or if this whole process overwhelms you and you need somebody to file the claim from the beginning for you, that is something that we can do as well. An accountant or a CPA can also help you file an injured spouse claim. You do not have to be an attorney to file that. You don't even have to be an attorney to file the administrative appeal. Unless it goes to court, you can do that without an attorney. But we are attorneys and we can help with that. If you want to give us a call, our help is free.
So the IRS keeps my refund every year because of a debt listed on our joint tax return. Is there anything I can do to stop the offset or remove the debt?
Great question. And now you can see we're going to a different topic. We're moving from injured spouse claims. We've said everything we can think of to say about injured spouse claims. So now we're transitioning into what's called innocent spouse relief. And to answer Maria's question, innocent spouse relief might be a way to stop the offset. It might be a way to even get your refund and avoid it being offset. Or if they've already offset prior years, it might be a way to get back some of your refund. And it might be a way to remove that joint tax liability that's associated with your name and Social Security number.
Well, what is this innocent spouse relief that you're talking about now?
Okay, so they sound similar, don't they, in a way? Injured spouse claim, innocent spouse relief. It really confuses some people. In fact, it used to confuse me when I first learned about it because I thought injured and innocent, isn't that the same thing? But they're very, very different remedies for different purposes. So innocent spouse relief. So let me kind of step back and this is something I mentioned earlier, but when you file a joint federal income tax return, both you and your spouse are liable for any debt that's listed on the return. This is true even if you get divorced and even if the judge says your spouse should have paid the debt. It's true even if you didn't earn any of the money on the tax return. So when you file a joint tax return, if your spouse omitted income, if your spouse claims certain deductions that they shouldn't have claimed or tax credits they shouldn't have claimed, when the IRS looks at that and makes that determination that you owe, or maybe you reported you owed yourself when you filed the return, then injured spouse will not help you because you owe the debt. Because when you file a joint return with your spouse, you're considered liable for that debt, even if it wasn't your income, regardless of what a state court judge said. You are liable. So innocent spouse relief is a way to convince the IRS that this is just not fair. You shouldn't be held responsible for this tax liability. Maybe one reason it's not fair is because you didn't earn any of the income. That's not going to be enough to win your case. But it's, it's one of the things you can use to argue. And we're going to talk about all the different things you can argue in just a second. But innocent spouse relief is your way of telling the IRS, look at my case. Listen to what I'm saying. It's not fair to hold me responsible for this joint tax liability. Here's why. And if you give me relief, then I will know, you will know now, that they will not be able to keep future refunds. You might get back some of the refunds they've already kept and any individual payments you've made on the debt, if you send in checks or payments. And it will get rid of the debt, the part that's associated with you. It will be wiped out. And then your spouse would owe the entire amount of the debt instead of, right now, you both owe it. They can go after either one of you on a joint tax return if there's a tax liability. The IRS can come after either spouse to ask for payment. And they'll go after what's easiest to collect, usually first, and that's a tax refund. So innocent spouse relief is your way maybe to get out of that joint tax debt and to protect your refunds and maybe even get back some of the refunds that you were taking and not owe that tax debt anymore.
What determines whether I actually get my prior year refunds back?
Okay. Well, what determines whether you get those prior year refunds back? There's really 3 types of innocent spouse relief, and what type you qualify for will determine if you get back your prior year refunds. Because there's 3 types, not all 3 types qualify for you to get the refund back. 2 of the types do that I'll go through. One type will just say, hey, you don't owe the tax liability anymore, but you're not getting any refunds back. So let's talk about the 3 types. Type number 1 is what we call pure innocent spouse relief. Type number 2 is separation of liability. And it's where the IRS basically goes through and they rework that return as if you filed separately. That, if you win innocent spouse relief through that second one, which is called separation of liability, you will not get any of your refunds back. The third type is equitable relief. And under equitable relief, that's where you really just say, hey, IRS, I may not qualify under pure innocent spouse relief, but look at all these things that have happened to me. And I want you to consider granting me relief because it's just fair to do so. And I'm a single mother, for example, now. Maybe we're divorced, but there's some good reasons why I don't need to be left in a position where I'm having to pay back this joint tax liability. So innocent spouse relief, 3 types: pure innocent spouse relief, separation of liability, equitable relief. The first and the third qualify for possible refunds. The second one does not, but the second one is still helpful if they won't give you relief under the other 2, because at least you won't owe the debt going further. So then your refunds in future years will be protected.
How do I qualify for that first one you mentioned, pure innocent spouse relief?
Okay, so there's 5 requirements. And the first one is you have to file a joint return with your spouse. Just like the injured spouse claim, you had to file jointly. So same thing with innocent spouse relief. You can't get relief from a debt that's just your debt, that where you filed as head of household or single or married filing separate. You have to file a joint tax return. And the tax liability has to remain unpaid. If you've already paid it in full, then pure innocent spouse relief or innocent spouse relief in general is not going to help you. So you have to have what's called an understatement of tax. And you say, what is that? That basically means for pure innocent spouse relief, the IRS has to have went in and changed your tax return. Maybe you were expecting a refund, or maybe you were expecting to owe $500, but the IRS went in and changed your return and says, oh, you don't owe $500, you owe $1,500. So there has to be a change made by the IRS. That's what's called an understatement, where they said you understated your tax on the original return. That has to happen. That's requirement number 2. Requirement number 3 means you really didn't know about the mistake that the IRS changed. So if income was missing from your return, you really didn't know that your spouse didn't claim all their income. If they left off a W-2, you didn't know what was turned into the tax preparer was missing his W-2. So there's a knowledge element here, and you didn't know about the income item that was left off the return, or maybe the tax credits that the IRS disallowed. You didn't know that you guys weren't qualified for those tax credits. So there's a knowledge requirement. You cannot have known about the omitted income or that the credits that were claimed that you didn't qualify for them at the time. The fourth requirement is there has to be, like we talked about, omitted income left off the return, or credits you did or you weren't entitled to. And whatever that mistake was, it has to be attributable to your spouse. In other words, it was from your spouse's income, or your spouse was the one qualifying you for the certain credits you didn't qualify for, or deductions. In other words, the thing the IRS fixed on the return and said you did wrong, it has to be coming from something your spouse did or didn't do on that return, especially income, omitted his or her omitted income, whoever was the person who omitted the income. And last, it has to be unfair. So there's a fairness component here. The fifth element is it has to be unfair. So 1, you have to file jointly. 2, the IRS has to change your tax return. 3, you didn't really know about the mistake when the return was filed, like the omitted income. 4, the omitted income or whatever the mistake was has to be because of your spouse or your spouse's income. And 5, it's unfair to hold you responsible. It's really hard for a lot of people to get pure innocent spouse relief. And there's also a 2-year time period for requesting it. Now, that 2-year time period starts when the IRS starts trying to collect from you. It doesn't start until then. So it's not when the return is filed that 2-year time period starts. But we still have a lot of people that we see come to us that the 2-year time period has expired. So that's why we can't pursue pure innocent spouse relief for those people.
What about this second one, separation of liability?
Right.
How do I qualify for that?
Perfect. And remember, and I'm sorry, Maria, didn't mean to cut you off. Jumping ahead. Remember, this is the one we don't really like a lot because you can't get your refunds back that they've taken. But if you win this one, they won't take your future refunds, and they can wipe out the tax debt that is attributable to you. Which is what you're wanting. So you file a joint return with your spouse, and the tax liability is still unpaid. So the first requirement is the tax debt you file jointly, just like the other one, just like pure innocent spouse relief, and the tax liability is unpaid. Number 2, and this one you have to either be divorced, legally separated, or if neither of those apply, you have to be living apart the last 12 months or for the past 12 months. So you have to be divorced, legally separated, or if you're not, you have to have been physically separated and living in a different residence for the last 12 months of the year to qualify for this one. The third requirement is the IRS changed your return again. It was not a tax liability you or your spouse reported. This is where the IRS went in and changed your return and said, oh, you owe more than what you said. Or you said you were due a refund. We say you owe money. So the IRS has to have made a change to your tax return to qualify for this one. And the last requirement is you didn't know about the missing income item or the erroneous deduction or credit that was claimed. So 4 things: you file jointly, it's not paid. Number 2, you're divorced, legally separated, or physically living apart the last 12 months of the year, or the past 12 months rather. That third, the IRS changed your tax return after you filed it and they say you owe more. And the fourth one is you didn't know about the missing income item. There's some other requirements too, but these are the 4 main requirements that you have to look at for separation of liability.
How about equitable relief, Mary?
Okay, because this is where we want to go if we can't get pure innocent spouse relief. We want equitable relief. Because if we win here, you get your refunds back that they've taken within the refund statute. I will say the refund statute for payments or refunds that are offset is payments or refunds that were offset in the last 2 years prior to you filing for innocent spouse relief. So you may not get them all back, but you can get those refunds the IRS has taken from you in the last 2 years. You can stop future refunds and maybe get, of course, the main, I think, benefit of innocent spouse relief is getting rid of that joint tax debt. So you've got to show it's unfair. Really, the law just says you have to demonstrate to the IRS that it's unfair for the IRS to hold you responsible for this joint tax liability. So because that definition is kind of broad, the IRS has come up with some guidance that they say that they will look at, some factors that they will consider for this type of relief. So if you're requesting it, these are factors you definitely want to highlight in your request. So one factor is that you show the IRS, for example, that you're now in economic hardship. You're suffering. What does that mean? Your expenses each month, your necessary living expenses are much higher than the income you're bringing in. If you're in economic hardship, that's one of the things that the IRS is going to look at for equitable innocent spouse relief. They're also going to look at, are you divorced or legally separated or living apart the last 12 months? Kind of like that separation of liability. If you're no longer with the person, then that gives the IRS more of an incentive to grant you this relief, to give you an opportunity to get back on your feet. So if you're no longer with them and you're in financial hardship or economic hardship, also if you are, excuse me, if you're suffering from any type of mental or physical health issue, that is a factor to look at. If you're a victim of abuse, the IRS loves that one because they understand if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you may have been forced into filing this joint return. And, excuse me. And even if you weren't forced into filing this joint return, it's still, you may not have felt like you could say no when your spouse said, hey, we want the biggest refund possible with this earned income credit, so we're filing jointly, and here, sign here now. So if you just did demonstrate to them that you are a victim of domestic violence, that is certainly something that they pay a lot of attention to in deciding you might qualify for this relief. Other things they look at, if you got divorced or you went to family court and you've got a legal paper saying that the other person should pay, and this is what happens with a lot of divorces, that maybe a good family lawyer has protected you and they've either got the judge to agree or your ex-spouse to agree that they'll be responsible for the tax debt. That paper, the IRS will look at as one of the factors because there's a court order saying that the other person should be responsible. So they'll look at that. So that's why family lawyers get that type of protection, even though it doesn't protect you without innocent spouse relief. You have to file innocent spouse relief, and specifically, it can be any of the three types. But having that legal paper, so it's saying the other person's responsible, will really help you. The IRS looks at, have you been filing your tax returns and paying any tax liabilities you owe for the subsequent years? So in other words, have you been a good taxpayer? Say maybe you owe this debt from back in 2018, but have you been good since then? Have you been filing your returns and paying your taxes? If so, that's a check mark in your favor. Another thing they're definitely going to be looking at is whether any of the tax liability is attributable to your spouse. If none of it's attributable to your spouse, then they're not going to give you relief. I mean, some of it has to be because of their income or something they did. So they look at, these are not the only factors. You could argue anything. You could argue, I'm a single mother now, and I'm the one, I have the primary custody of the children. And so because of that, I really need relief from this debt because it's hurting me, it's hurting the family and the children. So those are things you could argue. But the things I just touched on are things that they definitely pay a lot of attention to. And one thing they really look at is, how much did you know about that income that wasn't on return? If you file a joint return and your spouse submitted a W-2 and they only had one employer that whole year, and you did not see those wages on the tax return, the IRS is not going to really, they're going to say you had knowledge about this, and they're not going to look favorably about granting you equitable relief. They still can maybe file these other factors in your favor, but they place a lot of weight on whether you knew about the mistake that was made or the item giving rise to the mistake. So, but now if your spouse worked many jobs and there was a missing W-2 and he didn't claim it, then that's understandable. But they look and see how much knowledge you had about the item that is causing you as a couple on this joint return to owe a tax liability. So that's something they definitely consider.
Thank you for that. Well, how do I ask for innocent spouse relief?
You ask for innocent spouse relief by filing an IRS Form 8857. And again, you get that at the IRS website, the www.irs.gov. Put Form 8857 in the search box, or you call us, 866-481-3669. When you file your innocent spouse form, it is not like the injured spouse claim, it's only 2 pages. The innocent spouse form is 8 pages or more. You want to put any records that would support your case. So if you've got an order of protection, you want to attach it as a victim of abuse. If you just filed for one, even if the court didn't grant it, you still want to attach that ex parte order of protection. You want to include a financial statement, a proof of your income and expenses, any medical records that prove your health situation, any records you want the IRS to look at with those factors I talked about earlier to help agree that you're entitled to innocent spouse relief. You have to mail this Form 8857 and any attachments to the IRS. You cannot electronically file it. Some people make the mistake filing with the tax return. The IRS does not process these innocent spouse relief claims if they're electronically filed with the tax return. That's completely different than the injured spouse claim that we talked about earlier.
Well, can I ask for innocent spouse relief for more than 1 year?
Absolutely, you can. You can ask for 3 years, up to 3 years on the Form 8857. You can actually ask if you have 6 years that's owed from joint tax debts. You can ask for all 6 years, but you'll have to send in 2 8857s because you can only ask for 3 years on one, up to 3 years on one form. So if you have 9 years, then you're going to have to include 3 forms because the first form will have 3 years, the second form will have the next 3 years, and the last form will have the last 3 years. So you can ask for relief for more than 1 year, but on one form, you can only go up to 3 years on one form.
Well, when should I file for innocent spouse relief?
Oh, great question. You should file for it as soon as possible. If you heard about today, you want to get moving on this. It's better to file. Now, there's some situations where you do want to hold off a little bit. And that's a situation where maybe you're not divorced yet. And you would have a better case if you were able to show you were divorced. You definitely couldn't qualify for the second type if you weren't divorced or separated from your spouse the last 12 months, a year, and that's without a legal separation or have a legal separation. So if you're going to get divorced, you might want to wait after that, but you got to balance that with, are you getting ready to file a tax return? If you're getting ready to file a tax return, go ahead and file your request for innocent spouse relief way before or as soon as possible before you file your tax return. Because if you file for innocent spouse relief before you file your tax return that has a refund, it will protect your refund even if the IRS hasn't processed it and agreed, or they haven't made a decision that you qualify. Once you file for innocent spouse relief, they have to stop taking your refund. And so you want to file innocent spouse relief before you file a tax return listing a refund to protect that refund. Obviously, if you win and they've kept your refund, you might get it back if it's been kept in the last 2 years, and it's type 1 or type 3. But if you do that type 2, remember, you won't even get it back. But anybody, whether you end up getting type 1, type 2, type 3, pure innocent spouse relief, separation of liability, or equitable relief, if you file it before you file your return, it at least protects that current year tax refund. So you want to file it before you file your return if you can. So that's the most important thing to know about the innocent spouse relief. I do talk to domestic violence shelters, and I try to get information out to any victims of domestic violence that if they have joint tax liabilities, they want to consider filing for innocent spouse relief before they file their tax return and have the refund offset, because it won't matter. It matters if you win because you won't owe the debt anymore and you'll get back any refunds they've kept. But if you lose, you've protected that refund at least. So you want to file it before you file your return if you can, but don't file it with your return. Remember, it has to go before.
Well, how can I find out if I owe back taxes to the IRS then?
Okay, so if you don't already know, maybe you haven't received a letter, but maybe you think, oh, they probably sent me a letter, but I moved around a lot, so they didn't know where I last lived, so maybe I didn't get that letter. You can go to IRS website at www.irs.gov, and you can set up an account there and access your own tax records. You can download all your tax records and find out if you owe taxes to the IRS, because your IRS account transcript that you can download will show if you owe back taxes to the IRS. You can go back 10 years and see, which is generally a good time period if there's any tax liabilities that are listed under your name or social security number. But sometimes setting up that account on the IRS website is a little tricky and a little hard to do. And if you can't do it, then you can always call an attorney, get a tax preparer to do that for you, an accountant. You can call us at the 866-481-3669. And if we can open a case for you, we'll go and check and see if any of your account transcripts show there's a joint tax or there's a tax liability, especially a joint tax liability.
How long do I have to request innocent spouse relief?
Okay. Well, the pure innocent spouse relief and the separation of liability, you have 2 years, not from the date of you file the return, not from the date of when you file innocent spouse relief, but you have 2 years from the date that the IRS first started trying to collect from you. You have those 2 years to request type 1, type 2, pure innocent spouse relief or separation of liability. If you're asking for equitable relief, then you actually have, as long as the tax debt is owed out there, to ask for innocent spouse relief, as long as it's not paid. And generally, the IRS has 10 years from the date they make an assessment to collect So that might be from when you filed if you reported the tax liability. But if they changed it and made a new tax liability, that'll be the 10 years from the date they changed your return and made the tax liability. So it might be a little longer than 10 years, especially if they waited 2 years after you filed to change your return. So it's generally 10 years from the last date of assessment. Basically, if you still owe the liability, then you potentially still could file for at least equitable, the third type of innocent spouse relief.
What if the IRS denied my request for innocent spouse relief?
You will get a letter, which will generally give you 30 days to file an administrative appeal, which is an appeal with the IRS. And let's say that when you file the appeal, they don't overturn their decision. They say, we're still denying you innocent spouse relief. They will send you a certified letter giving you 90 days to file an appeal in the United States Tax Court. So if you need help with filing either an administrative appeal or an appeal to the court because they've denied your request, you would want to give us a call at the 866-481-3669 and let us find an attorney to maybe help you with this. Where I said, injured spouse claims, the thing we talked about first, you don't have to have an attorney at all. Innocent spouse relief, you don't have to have an attorney to request it. But if you need to appeal it to the court, you're going to have an attorney. And innocent spouse relief is a whole lot harder to get from the IRS than an injured spouse claim. So it's generally recommended you try to get an attorney if you can access one to get you that type of relief.
What if I never agreed to file a joint tax return with my spouse?
Okay, this is a completely different category from injured spouse claim or innocent spouse relief. If you never consented, and meaning you never agreed to file that joint return, then you're not responsible for that tax liability on that joint return. Now, you got to be really careful here because the courts and the IRS have said consent doesn't have to be you saying, okay, husband, okay, wife, I agree to file a joint return. If you filed joint returns in the past and a joint return was filed in the particular year, there's a tax liability, the IRS is really going to question you and say, well, you must have consented. This, they call it tacit consent. You must have agreed because your prior history shows you've always filed joint returns. So your case, it's going to be a little hard to convince the IRS that you didn't intend to, but it's not impossible. But one thing that would help you if you find out there's a joint tax debt and you didn't consent to it, you need to immediately, if you haven't already, file a separate return to say, I didn't file that joint return with my spouse. I never agreed to it. Because that's one thing they look at is, did you go ahead and file a separate return, which would kind of dispute that joint filing. So you want to do that as soon as possible. But you can always appeal the joint filing if you didn't agree to it. And you could call an attorney or us at the Legal Aid Society so we could evaluate and see, how you would file an appeal. We know how you would file an appeal, but whether you would have a strong appeal and what type of documents we'd need to help prove that you never filed this joint return. But this is a whole separate category from the other things that we talked about, where an injured spouse claim, you intend to file jointly. Innocent spouse relief, you intended to file jointly. This is where you never intended to. Maybe he or she went out and fraudulently signed your name, or you told them, I don't want to file with you, and they still went out and filed a joint return to get a big tax refund, but you never ever agreed to it. In fact, you told them not to. And maybe you even filed a separate return to help prove that. So this is something completely different, and this is something you generally need an attorney to help you with, or a CPA at least.
What if I owe federal income tax liabilities, Mary, and don't qualify for an injured spouse claim or innocent spouse relief?
Well, that's a big question that would take us a whole hour session to go over. But I will say this. If you owe a tax debt and you don't qualify for the things we talked about today, but you can't afford it to pay it in full, then you should give us a call. There are lots of things called collection alternatives that we can take that help you get that tax debt paid, or maybe get that tax debt completely removed. Some things like setting up a payment plan or installment agreement with the IRS, getting your account put in currently not collectible status if you can't afford to pay, or maybe even getting an IRS offering compromise or settlement to wipe out the tax debt. So don't suffer alone. Don't suffer in silence. If you have a debt, even if it don't qualify for anything we talked about today, and it's owed to the Internal Revenue Service, give us a call.
And thank you, Mary, so much for all of the great information today. Again, if you have other questions, you can drop them in the chat box, or please, as we've said quite a few times this evening, call our hotline at the Tennessee Taxpayer Project, 1-866-481-3669.
Thank you, Maria, for so eloquently articulating all these good questions.
Anytime. Well, thank you very much. And I think this ends our session tonight.